This is not the story of a tank. It's the story of three men locked inside it. Every time you see a T-72 turret flying into the sky in some grainy clip behind that split second is a chain of strategic decisions, engineering choices, and military doctrine stretching from World War II all the way to today. In this video, we are not just asking, did they live or die, but rolling the tape backwards. Why were T-72 crews put inside a machine like this in the first place? How does it actually work? And what really happens inside when the tank is hit? The T-72 was born out of the military thinking and doctrine of the 1960s, which were deeply shaped by the lessons of armored warfare drawn from World War II. In a very short time, tanks had evolved at breakneck speed from thinly armored tin boxes on tracks with machine guns into highly sophisticated machines well protected and heavily armed, especially with the 125 mm smoothbore gun and an autoloader designed to directly counter NATO armored formations on a European battlefield. But that was still only the beginning of what was coming. In the Cold War context, if the front lines in Europe ever erupted again, which spearheads of steel would rush forward first? From that very fear, Soviet military thinking began to gestate a new generation of tanks, learning from its clashes with Tigers and Panthers, and then pushing everything into a new technological arms race. The T-72 was the product of that era, and this was only the opening act. When Soviet marshals looked back at World War II, they didn't just remember Germany's steel predators. They remembered even more the endless columns of T-34s grinding through the mud of Eastern Europe. They saw very clearly a single T-34 might fall short in optics armor or refinement, but when hundreds of them appeared on one front, the balance of the war began to tip. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be numerous and get the job done. That was the mindset of accepting high losses in exchange for strategic gain. And that very mindset stamped itself onto the next generation of tanks. Sitting at the drawing boards for the T-72 Soviet engineers and generals were not dreaming of a flawless machine. They were thinking of a design that could be multiplied into tens of thousands in a short time. It was still the spirit of the T-34, but upgraded, stronger firepower, better armor, more powerful engine, while still simple enough that a young conscript after just a few months of rush training could climb in and roll straight into combat. When the T-64A appeared, it was less a new tank and more a technological leap. A 700 horsepower engine, 125 mm smoothbore gun composite armor, and especially the autoloader. All of that forced the entire world to take notice. A crew of only 3 in a smaller, lower, lighter hull, yet with firepower comparable to the top Western tanks. On paper, this was the future of Soviet armor. But on the training grounds and in frontline units, the T-64 showed another face complicated hard to maintain demanding very high levels of technical skill and logistics. To put it politely, it was a temperamental machine. That experience forced the Soviet High Command to adjust its thinking. They could not just chase everything cutting edge. They needed a tank that kept what the T-64 did well: strong firepower, compact-sized three-man crew, but with the reliability and simplicity of the T-62. From this came the concept of a mobilization tank. The T-64 and later the T-80 would serve with elite units, while another simpler model would be produced in huge numbers to equip mass mobilization forces across the entire country if war broke out. The goal was not the best tank in the world, but the tank that could be mass-produced, easy to operate, easy to train crews on. A repeat of the T-34's Spirit win with numbers that can actually fight. Object 172 was born in that context. It still used the 125mm gun and autoloader, but switched to a V12 diesel engine of about 780 horsepower with a more classical design philosophy, prioritizing practicality, durability, and the ability to roll off production lines in large batches. And from Object 172, the name T-72 stepped into history. When Object 172 officially rolled off the line with the name T-72, the Soviets weren't just creating a new tank. They were creating a strategic tool. The T-72's greatest advantage didn't lie in any single technical detail, but in this, it could be produced 40–50% faster than the T-64 and at a far lower cost. What does that mean in reality? It means more than 25,000 T-72s could roll out of factories in the Soviet Union, and Allied states enough to blanket half of Europe in steel if needed. From the other side of the Iron Curtain, NATO officers looked through their binoculars and saw a tank that could withstand 100 to 5mm rounds hitting its frontal armor head-on, surviving many older generations of anti-tank weapons. They quickly realized they had to upgrade to 120mm guns on the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams. Ironically, what the West saw in the export versions was a downgraded configuration, which led them to underestimate the T-72s actually serving in Red Army units. Yet whether they understood it correctly or not, the sheer mass of T-72s was a cold reminder. If war ever broke out, steel would speak before words did. In the T-72, everything begins with a choice that at first glance looks very rational. Remove the human loader and keep only a three-man crew. The hull shrinks by nearly a meter. The tank profile becomes lower and lighter, yet it still keeps the 125mm gun and mobility. On paper, a smart design. The 22-round Carousel under the turret floor allows each shot to come about every 7 seconds, sparing the crew's strength and maintaining steady fire. But what is the price? The commander and gunner are wedged between the breech and the turret walls, surrounded by ammo stacked from their feet up to their shoulders, literally sitting on the ammunition rack. If the tank is penetrated, the time to escape is almost zero. Meanwhile, many Western tanks separate the ammo compartment and use blow-off panels to vent the explosion outward. The T-72 only armor protects the Carousel. It's the reserve ammunition that becomes the real nightmare. The driver up front in the hull has more room but is held back by a very slow reverse. And in a kind kind of irony. That same hull is equipped with a snorkel for deep fording and a full NBC protection system, as if it were prepared for every scenario except the moment it actually takes a hit. When the T-72 first smelled gunpowder, it did not step onto the stage quietly. There's an oft-repeated story that during Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, the first Syrian T-72s, freshly delivered from the Soviet Union, faced Israeli tanks and even managed to knock out modern Merkavas. Even though the details are still debated, that rumor alone was enough to chill NATO conference rooms, the steel monster T-72 seemed to have entered the arena and was ready to crush its opponents. Its peak reputation came in the Iran-Iraq War. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq received hundreds of T-72Ms, among the most advanced tanks in the region, facing older Western models like the M60 Patton and Chieftain in Iranian service. In many tank engagements, the T-72 had clear advantages in firepower, armor, and range, with some battles seeing entire formations smashed in just a few hours. It's no surprise it became the most feared tank of that war. But that same period also began to reveal its Achilles heel in urban environments. At close range, a single RPG-7 hit to the flank, rear, or turret roof was enough to ignite the ammunition. When that happened, the tank was often completely destroyed, and the chances of the crew getting out in time were almost zero. In the 1991 Gulf War, the T-72 entered a battlefield completely different from where it had shined in the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq deployed multiple T-72 variants alongside older Soviet tanks, while on the other side stood Abrams tanks, going into combat for the first time. Even within the coalition there were nerves. How would America's new tank fare against the steel legend from the East? On paper, Iraq seemed to have advantages. T-72s dug into revetments and defensive positions, lying in wait on open desert terrain where American tanks would have to advance over exposed ground. But the night in the middle of sandstorms became home turf for the Abrams and Bradley, with thermal sights, night vision specialized in armor-piercing rounds, and tight coordination with aircraft. The result was about 150 T-72s knocked out of action without a single American tank destroyed in that engagement. Many Iraqi crews never even saw their enemy. From that point on, the T-72's image flipped from steel monster to something close to a steel coffin, if it lacked a well-trained crew at the back of combined arms. The legend of invincibility was gone, but the lessons on how to employ armor properly remain fully valid to this day. When Russian tanks rolled into Grozny at the end of 1994, they carried with them an illusion. Just drive in with columns of T-72s and T-80s like a parade, and the enemy would be stunned into dropping their weapons. What waited for them was something entirely different. In the ruined city blocks, small mobile Chechen anti-tank teams lay hidden on upper floors with personal anti-tank weapons and well-prepared ambush plans. They did not rush to fire. They waited until the armored column had pushed deep into the center, then knocked out the lead, and tail vehicles sealing off the escape route. The T-72's frontal armor was almost never penetrated, but the tanks were hit from the sides, the top, and the rear of the turret, where the armor was thin and close to the ammunition. The main gun could not elevate high enough to return fire at upper stories, forcing the Russians to bring in ZSU anti-aircraft guns just to shoot buildings. Within a single day, most of the T-72s committed were knocked out of action, and Grozny earned a new title tank graveyard. In 1991, when the Yugoslav wars erupted, the T-72 family was dragged back onto a very familiar stage: urban combat. At Vukovar M84s, Yugoslav-made copies of the T-72 were thrown into assaults on Croatian guerrilla forces. On the map, Trpinjska Cesta was just a small road. On the ground, it was a death funnel, narrow-lined with civilian houses, no side streets, one way in and one way out. If tanks drove in without infantry properly accompanying them, they were practically locking themselves into a perfect trap. And that is exactly what happened. Croatian fighters calmly let the armored column advance deep in waiting until most of the tanks had fully entered the tunnel, before snapping the trap shut. RPG-7s set the lead and tail vehicles on fire at such close range that even the shooters themselves had trouble with the fuses. The rest of the column was jammed tight in the kill zone infantry, trapped between the vehicles, with nowhere to take cover. Many crews tried to push the burning wrecks aside to clear a path out. Some tanks slid into the roadside ditches. In a very short time, Trpinjska Cesta had earned itself a new name tank graveyard, mirroring Grozny just a few years later. If we look at Ukraine today, we're forced to swallow an uncomfortable truth. Almost no tank currently in service was designed for the kind of modern warfare it is now facing. When the T-72 was born, personal anti-tank weapons were still relatively simple. Now we have tandem warheads punching through explosive reactive armor, top attack missiles like the Javelin, and above all, drones. Eyes and hands in the sky that both guide artillery fire and strike directly at the roof or rear of the tank, where it is always weakest. People have tried everything: cage armor, add-on armor, turtle tanks. But these are just small umbrellas in a storm of ever smarter munitions. The question is no longer which tank is the strongest, but is the tank being used inside a true combined arms system, with reconnaissance, air defense, and infantry alongside it or not? In Ukraine, it is not just the T-72. Abrams Leopard or any other tank can be knocked out if it stands alone.